In part three, we're going to talk about imperialism in Africa, which is, I think, what a lot of people think of when they think of the new era of imperialism. Something to consider: before 1885, only 10% of the continent of Africa was controlled by Europe. It was some trading on the Gold Coast. North Africa had a presence of Italians and French, and there were Dutch Boer farmers in South Africa. That's about it. In 1876, things really start to change quickly. King Leopold II of Belgium sends Henry Stanley to go claim Belgian Congo as his personal colony. Now, this is not the colony of Belgium. This is his own fiefdom. Like, he owns it. It's so weird. It's 80 times the size of Belgium itself, and he promised to use Belgian Congo for research. But what really happened was torture, terrorism, and genocide. It was a terrible, terrible experience. We'll look at that in class next week, but it was not what he said it would be. However, it was also remarkably lucrative, lots of money to be made there, and it inspired other nations to want to go get African colonies for themselves because, as bad as the things were in Belgium, in the Belgian Congo, there was a lot of money to be made. So they're like, well, we need that too. So this political cartoon, for example, is a jab at Leopold II, and you can see, and I know it's kind of gross, like his hand has been chopped off, his foot has been chopped off, and he's hanging with these vultures, and basically, this is what they would do to the Africans in the Congo, the Congolese people, and this is happening to King Leopold, so it's kind of a response to the way he treated those people, and again, we'll read about that in some documents. So imperialism in Africa, how does it really ramp up? This period between 1880 and 1885, we call it the Scramble for Africa. It featured competition devolving into war amongst European nations. We were afraid that the next big war might start over this rush, this scramble, and conflict over who's going to get what in Africa. Fortunately, it doesn't. We push that off for now because in 1884 and 1885, the French and the Germans, specifically Otto von Bismarck, invites the countries of Europe to this meeting to sit down and divide up Africa without using violence or war, and carve up what they called the delicious cake of Africa. So they sit over a map, there's no Africans there, and they carve up who's going to get what. And this does diffuse the crisis, but the rivalries continue. To read about the conquering of the Sudan, for example, by the British in Mackay. But look at this, by 1900, 90% of Africa is colonized. 90%. We went from 10% of a presence of Europeans to 90% in, a decade and a half. So here's a map. We can take a look at this map real quick, and this is Africa after the the Conference of Berlin. But the insert map down here, 1878, look at this. Look at it. It's literally, you have some trading presence on the coast. Same thing over here in East Africa, and that's it. And Cape Colony with the Dutch. A short while after that, 90% of Africa is colonized. The only spots that are exceptions is Liberia, which was created after the Civil War as a place to repatriate slaves in Africa, and Ethiopia was able to resist Italian occupation by buying weapons from the French and the Russians and hiding in the mountains and practicing guerrilla warfare. A lot of this has to do, the why of it has to do with the white man's burden and social Darwinism. We talked about social Darwinism in the previous chapter, which was this natural domination of the colonized races. This idea that we can take Darwin's theories and apply them to race, and there are superior races and inferior races. The Europeans are racially superior to the people of Africa and India and Asia, and that justifies why they should be launching wars against them and colonizing them and dominating them. There's also the white man's burden, which is famous from the Rudyard Kipling poem, and it's this belief that Europeans had a moral obligation to civilize the people of the colonies as best they can. So they forced assimilation into the European cultures. They pushed Christianity on them through missions. They would quote-unquote teach work ethic through grueling labor and say, oh, it's good for them, you're building work ethic. They didn't have it. So this is the white man's burden. It was this, it's so hard to do this, and we don't want to do it, but it's our responsibility to fix these people as best we can, knowing they can never be truly equal, because that is racism, my friends. There were critics just so you know, there were critics of imperialism at this time. The majority of Europeans did support imperialism. They saw it as a way to build strong nations at home and flex the muscle of national superiority, but there were people who were speaking out against this. Probably the most famous one was J.A. Hobson. He was a British economist. He was kind of a socialist. And he argued in his seminal work that imperialism was a result of unregulated capitalism. It's capitalism run amok. We've run out of ways to make money in our country, so now we go out and we dominate other people to do it. He argued that colonies were not beneficial to the state, the government in the long run. They would cost more money. And to the people themselves, it was really only beneficial to the few rich people that were making tons of money off of it. And it diverted resources away from domestic issues because you had to send soldiers and reinforcement to these colonies when it could be used at home. So J.A. Hobson was probably the strongest voice at this time against imperialism. He was in the minority. Joseph Conrad also wrote the book Heart of Darkness, which exposed the torture and crimes against Africans at this time. It was a novel based on a true story up the Congo River. Edward Morrell had a response to Rudyard Kipling's white man's burden with the black man's burden. International socialists, so not these domestic democratic socialists that we're talking about in Germany, for example, but international socialists pinned imperialism as the final stage of capitalism. We're headed towards that Marxist revolution. And social critics point out to the hypocrisy of how can you expand rights and voting for people in Europe and then deny all of those freedoms to these people abroad. And the response to that was always, well, they're not capable of the greatness we achieve in Europe because of, the whole social Darwin thing. So what were the responses to imperialism? They were mostly violent uprisings against the colonizers. This almost always ended poorly for the natives. The Europeans had superior weapons and training. They had the Maxim gun, now the machine gun, which is a new weapon we'll talk all about in World War I. There were kind of two different approaches that the people of the colonies could take. Traditionalists rejected Western ways. Modernists, let's adapt to the West. Most Asians and Africans eventually conformed to the imperial presence, but there were definitely resistors. For example, in German East Africa, we had the Maji Maji Rebellion, and these are two men who were captured during that, and you can see they're literally in shackles, they're in chains. The Maji Maji Rebellion was an uprising against the German presence in East Africa, modern-day Tanzania. Unfortunately, it did not end well for the Africans. In fact, they thought that they were immune to the bullets of the Germans if they had just practiced certain superstitions, and obviously that wasn't true. So that's pretty, symbolic of the failed resistance of these Africans at this time. British India is a little bit different. The British East India Company had a trading presence in India during the Mughal Empire, but when the empire collapsed in 1757, the British East India Company took control with a sepoy force. The sepoys were these Indian soldiers who were hired and trained by the British East India Company to kind of keep the peace and do the policing in India. That worked fine until what Mackay calls the Great Rebellion, could also be called the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857, when over a rumor about cow fat and pig fat on the cartridges, which would be against their religions, broke out. The sepoys rose up and tried to kick out the British East India Company and restore the Mughal dynasty. This fails. It takes a year to put it down, though. It's bloody, it's violent, thousands of people die, and it's a scary, scary, scary warning shot to the British government that maybe we need to take direct control or we're going to lose our crown jewel colony. So Queen Victoria's government takes direct control of the Raj, the British parts of India, in 1857. So, what was British India like? There was an upper-class Indian bureaucracy that was given some local power, but for the most part it was all the British that made the decisions, passed the laws. There was no decision-making really of importance that was being done by Indians. But that upper-class Indian bureaucracy became a louder voice for self-rule as time went on, and the Indian National Congress was established in 1885 and began to push the issue with surging Indian nationalism. Now, the Indian National Congress was not actually a Congress. It's not a governing body. It was a body that was pushing for self-rule. So in some ways, the way that the British established the Raj actually contributed to and helped birth the modern Indian identity and the Indian nationalist movement. You'll read more about that in Mackay. And here's the Indian National Congress. Japan, what's happening in Japan after that forced opening? The Tokugawa shogun were overthrown in 1857 and replaced with their traditional Meiji emperor. So they overthrow the government in 1857, and this begins a rapid embrace of Western ways. They send their elite class young men out to get educated in colleges and universities in the West. They adopt the strong autocratic German constitution that Otto von Bismarck is running in Germany. Why? Because it's closest to their emperor ruling over the people type society that they've had, even if the shogun were in charge for a while. And they raise a modern army and develop a rail system and industrial capability, and they do all this in a very short amount of time. Very short amount of time. And what we see is that the Japanese quickly become an imperial power. They actually start to go out and dominate other people. This country that was really, backwards and closed off from the world for 400 years, in just 50 years has become a powerhouse. Now this is a painting, a Japanese painting of the Russo-Japanese War, which exemplifies that new power that Japan has. So different ways that they go out and start to dominate other people. They forced Korea to open to them in 1876. By 1910, Korea is a colony of Japan. Very brutal acquisition there. They took control of Taiwan in the Sino-Japanese War, where they beat up on poor China in 1895. But it's the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 that shows the world that Japan is now a power, because it's a mostly naval conflict with Russia over Manchuria, and they upset a European power. They beat Russia. Now, I don't know whether we should see that as more embarrassing for Russia or more impressive for Japan, but it has both implications. And at this point, after the Russo-Japanese War, it's clear that Japan's goal is to now create an empire in Asia. Last but not least, let's talk about the fall of dynastic China. The Chinese were increasingly frustrated with Western domination. Officials were spending taxes on opium, like we talked about in the first video, other excesses as well, while Chinese people starved to death. So the Taiping Rebellion was kind of the first resistance of the Chinese people over that, and it took a long time. It was 10 years, tens of millions of people killed in a long conflict against Western control. And this was kind of the first warning that things are about to change in China. In the Sino-Japanese War in 1895, that takes a toll as well. Japan absolutely embarrasses China. And we have another uprising with the Boxer Rebellion, which was an attack on Western interests. And you should read into that more if you get a chance, because it's an interesting. The Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists is a pretty interesting story. But nonetheless, there's an attack on Western interests. The Embassy Row in Beijing is attacked. And France and Germany, and even I think the help of the United States and Great Britain, they have to come in and occupy parts of Beijing to put that down for the Chinese. And this does not end well for the Chinese here. So that forces the Chinese to, the Qing dynasty to enact 100 days of reform in 1898, where they try to overhaul the government, bring in more people when it comes to decision making. Doesn't really work. And by 1912, the Qing dynasty has collapsed in favor of a weak Chinese republic, which, if we were going on into the history of China, you would see that that's not going to last very long either. Sun Yat-sen will overthrow that as a dictator. But here's a picture from the Boxer Rebellion, and you can just see that China, again, although it was not formally a colony of any of these countries, was absolutely dominated economically and politically by the European countries during this time. So that's your crash course in New Imperialism through these 3 videos. Good luck with your reading and your outlining. We will fly through this next week in class, and then it's on to World War I.